Paul, have you been influenced by any black composers, or can you tell us about any black composers that you've...
Indeed. You know, at school, I was never taught about black classical composers, or indeed, I guess, the black presence in Europe, you know, post-war, you know, from the Moors in 500 AD, going all the way up, and how their music, with the black Moors from Africa and the Arabs' music, and the poetry of Rumi, Sufi poet, influenced the development of early music and the troubadours, which went into the Elizabethan tradition.
Okay.
All of that's fascinating, and the instruments at that time are very similar. Also with Irish music, they chronicle their music to North Africa, with the barons and the way that they sing, and the kind of improvised ornamentation on the vocal line. So that going into Baroque music, really interesting. With European history and culture, it seems that the Catholic period was embracing of a kind of their kind of pagan past in a way, much more sensual. So their music, there's a lot more going on rhythmically in there. But the Protestant, I think, was about being away from pleasure, so they all became very straight again. So there's a time where I believe European music and the music of the Middle East, would you say, the Mediterranean and parts of Africa, were not that different, because their religion and their ceremony was very dance-worthy. But I went on to learn after the Moors about people like George Bridgetower, who was a violinist. In fact, he was like the top violinist for Beethoven. So Beethoven used to compose for him to do all the premieres. So he was up and down, the top guy in Europe.
I would never have known that.
You know, he used to live in the Mall as a guest of the Prince of Wales, the son of George the Fourth. You know, all of this has kind of got on here. Joseph Emedy is a very fascinating story because he was press ganged. He was taken as a slave from Guinea to Brazil, and then taken by the Portuguese to Portugal. And he ended up at the age of about 22 being the second principal violinist of the Lisbon Opera. So, you know, so one day, Captain Edward Pellows, who's been talked about, I don't know if you know Hornblower, the program on TV. Pellows is very much involved with that. Well, Pellows, on the Indefatigable, which is the very ship in Hornblower, saw him at the opera and thought, I'm having a bit of that. So they press ganged him after one of his operas, put him on the ship. He had to play jigs for about 7 years, having played like the best, most sophisticated music. And then he was dumped in Cornwall. So basically, he became the big cheese in Cornwall, ended up in Truro, and is buried in Truro, died in 1835. We actually did a concert in honor of him. What's interesting about that period of music is that not everything was written on the page. There was cadenza, and you could improvise an ornament. So one is always, you know, curious as to what might those musicians have brought with them from the blend of cultures around them, including their African backgrounds, but other aspects of gypsy music in Europe or folk music into their classical composition. In the 20th century, you know, we have people like William Grant Still, who was the first composer to be commissioned by a major symphony orchestra, the Orchestra of Rochester in America, and composed the African-American Symphony. He also was a great influence to George Gershwin, he and W.C. Handy, and had been orchestrators. At the time, you couldn't get a publishing deal as a black man in those days of apartheid in America. So often a white composer would have to front for them. I'm not quite sure whether they got paid all their royalties. But now you have people like Akin Yuba, who's from Nigeria, who's a professor of composition. He's resident at Cambridge College and does a convention of African composers, black music composers every year. And also Ninketieh, who's Ethiopian and also has been a professor in Boston. So there is a tradition now about looking at the plethora of black music and looking at the classical tradition and knowing that Austrians and the Russians and French and all of them have kind of found a way of bringing in their folk feel melody, rhythm, and harmony and story, subject matter into orchestral music, that we know the more we start translating from our popular black music, our gospel music, our jazz or African music, you know, that we'll create something incredible for ballet, opera, orchestra music, song cycles, chamber music, etc. So that's a really exciting thing for me whenever I, you know, have a piece of African drumming and I can think of a pianistic interpretation of that.
Paul, wouldn't you like to give us an example of that?
Yeah, I guess I could do. I mean, there's one particular part in Awakening, the ballet we spoke about earlier on.